together. We are here for an interview with Machon. She is former MI5 officer and is now here with us in Switzerland. Welcome to Switzerland, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk with you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
We want to talk to you about false flag terrorism, which you blew the whistle on.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you wrote a book, Spies, Lies and Whistleblower, together with your colleague David Shayler.
Yeah.
How did it get so far that you blew the whistle on this issue?
Well, it was a sort of long and painful process. We were both recruited to work for MI5, which is the UK Domestic Security Service, in 1991. And at that point, they said that they were changing the way they worked, because for the first 80 years of their history up until that point, they hadn't officially existed. And they'd done all sorts of illegal activities and illegal operations. But in the late 1980s, they were finally put on a legal footing. And they also told us when we were being recruited that they needed a new generation of officers who, instead of looking at the old style work, which was counter-espionage, counter-subversion, which is sort of political activism, they wanted people to work on counter-terrorism style targets, which is a very different method of working. So although I was initially sceptical about working for an organisation that had a very bad rep at that point, they sounded quite reassuring during the very long, drawn-out recruitment process. But we were both there for about 6 years, and we had 3 different postings, each different sections. And we saw so many things going wrong that incrementally it seemed to get worse and worse and worse, until finally in our final posting to G Branch, which was the international terrorism section, we saw 2 cases of false flag terrorism. And the case that made us quit, the case that made us resign and then go public and blow the whistle, was a very heinous example of this. And this is what became known in the media as the Gaddafi assassination plot.
Okay.
And what happened with that was that a Libyan military intelligence officer, who became codenamed Tomworth, volunteered. He walked into the British embassy in Tunis and asked to speak to the resident MI6 officer and asked for help in trying to effect a coup against Colonel Gaddafi. This was back in 1995. And MI6 said, well, what can we do? And what Tomworth wanted was money to fund the coup attempt. So MI6 paid a lot of money to this group. And Tomworth was quite upfront at the time. He said, I have a ragtag group of Islamic extremists, some of whom had actually been veterans from Afghanistan. Of course, we all know what that means nowadays.
Okay.
And he said that they needed funding, they could pull off this coup, and would MI6 help? And they did. And MI6, the contact in MI6, whose sort of James Bond number was not 007, it was PT16B, worked very closely with David Shayler, who was his counterpart in MI5. He was head of the Libyan section then in MI5. And David was briefed all the way through this plot. And initially he thought it was one of these sort of mad James Bond schemes that MI6 was always coming up with. And he didn't think it would really go ahead. But in early 1996, he suddenly started seeing all these different pieces of information and intelligence from different sources coming across his desk, saying there had indeed been an assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi. And what had happened was that Gaddafi had gone to a Libyan People's Congress in Sirte and was driving back to Tripoli in a cavalcade of cars. And an explosion occurred underneath the car in the cavalcade, of course the wrong car, because Gaddafi survived that attempt. And innocent people died in the car, and then innocent bystanders were killed in the ensuing security shootout. So he went back to PT16B and said, well, is this what you were talking about? And PT16B apparently turned around and said, yes, we did it, that was our man. Until David said, well, actually, you haven't done it, have you? You've killed innocent people and Gaddafi's still alive. And then turned out, and it was even worse, that MI6 had not got prior ministerial permission for this operation, which they needed to do to make it legal. So what we were looking at was a murder plot that went wrong and killed innocent people, which was illegal under UK law, and it was highly reckless in a very sort of volatile part of the world. So we couldn't really think of anything much worse than that. So that's why we left, and that's why we decided to blow the whistle.
So you tell me that the MI5 was a secret organization before? It was not legal by...
Yeah, it was founded in 1909 to counter German espionage in the run-up to the First World War. And from then until 1989, it just didn't officially exist. So there was a very famous whistleblower in the 1980s called Peter Wright. He wrote a book called Spycatcher, which caused a huge international stink. And he said, quite sort of proudly, I think, that in his time in MI5, they could bug and burgle their way around London with impunity. They could do whatever they wanted, because nobody was allowed to know what they did. So even MPs were not allowed to know what the spies were up to. And in fact, a lot of MPs were being investigated by the
military
spies.
police.
Well, yes, that's what it officially, military intelligence. It was sort of different sections in the military in the Second World War. and they ended up being stuck with the number 5.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Secret Intelligence Service is MI6, and that's a sort of international intelligence gathering wing. So in the UK we have 3 key intelligence agencies. So there's MI5, MI6 and GCHQ, which is the listening post.
Okay. And are they authorized to do actions, or should they actually be classical Secret Service to gather information? Or are they authorized to really do actions?
Well, it's a very good question, because throughout most of MI5's history, they were there to gather intelligence and to counter espionage, which, of course, if you found that there was a Russian spy operating out of the Russian embassy in London, then they would be ejected, they'd be thrown out of the country, but that's all that happened. So it's very much an intelligence game, and that intelligence was secret knowledge, which couldn't usually generally be used. Now, then they started shifting in the late 1980s to more terrorism-style work, and this is where a real problem has developed, I think, in the UK, because you have an intelligence organisation used only to gathering information and hoarding it, suddenly being asked to investigate fast-paced terrorist operations and gather evidence, which is very different from intelligence. So evidence is an evidential chain that you use to put in front of a court and try and get someone convicted for terrorist activity or something. So there was a real problem in the 1990s where you have the sort of the senior management, the old guard, who were only used to looking at very slow-paced intelligence operations, suddenly having to manage all these new people coming in who were working on evidential gathering terrorist operations. And there was a clash, and the management really didn't get with what was required when you were doing a proper terrorism investigation. So that was a major problem, and I think we're still seeing that. You know, post 9/11, we're looking at this sort of huge explosion of intelligence and security. It's almost like a sort of military intelligence complex these days. And we have these spies who still want to work in much more an intelligence-based world rather than an evidence-based world, trying to run to keep catching up with what should be counter-terrorism police-style operations.
How does the Secret Services recruit their people? How did they get to you?
Well, in the old days, it was much more discreet. I actually applied to be a diplomat, so I applied to the UK Foreign Office. And then I had this letter on Ministry of Defence notepaper, which said there may be other jobs you'd find more interesting. And I remember opening it and reading it and thinking, oh my God, it's MI5, what have I done? I was actually really frightened because they did have a pretty bad reputation at that point. But my father was with me when I opened the letter. My father was a journalist, so he was saying, oh, go on, just ring up and see if it is MI5, go on. So that sort of started the whole process, and the recruitment process went on for about 10 months. You know, it's very long, very intensive, and they said all the right things. You know, we had lots of ethical discussions and everything, and they sounded good. And every time I kept getting through to the next level, I thought, well, perhaps they're not as they are portrayed in the media. Perhaps they really are, you know, a decent organisation to work for, and I seem to be right for them. Of course, when I started working there, I realised pretty quickly that they hadn't been 100% truthful in what they told me when I was being recruited. And nowadays, of course, it's much easier. They have a website which is just mi5.org.uk or something, or .gov.uk, and you can actually go on the website and apply.
You can apply yourself?
You can, and in fact, they've just put up a test, a sort of little spy test, and if you get through that, then you'll go for the interview. So.
You say false flag terrorism is a standard weapon in the arsenal of governments and spies. Is there a kind of a handbook for CIA or MI6 agents how to do false flag operations, or is this outside of the legal...
It's outside of the legal framework, of course.
Always.
It is. Yeah. A bit like the idea of torture used to be completely beyond the pale. Nobody was supposed to get involved with that. And certainly the UK knew that because they'd had experience of it in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s, when the whole civil war, you know, with the IRA kicked off in about 71, 72. They made all those mistakes there. The British Army went in and they interned terrorist suspects, they tortured terrorist suspects, and they realised that by treating that community like that, it was actually a breeding ground for more terrorists. So that made it counterproductive, and of course it is also unethical. So in the 1990s, MI5 and MI6 just said we don't do anything like that, we do not get involved in that sort of stuff. But of course since 9/11, and the brutal and muscular response of the American intelligence agencies to the subject, I suppose most Western agencies now have got their hands dirty and become involved in torture again. So it's a difficult one. I don't think in terms of false flag it's a standard, well, I don't think it would be a standard practice even now. The Gaddafi plot, for example, appears to have been a few rogue officers within the agency. It was kept very sort of close and to know. I don't think there's any sort of this is what we all do as an organisation. If something like that goes on, it will be very tightly held.
How do they do this? How do they keep these secrets from the other parts of the intelligence people working there?
Well, you work in smallish sections. So, for example, you might have a section that investigates Middle Eastern terrorism or just Libyan terrorism or something, and they operate on a principle of need to know. So you're not supposed to talk about what you're specifically working on with other colleagues, even within the organisation. Of course, people do gossip, after work in the bar and things like that. But if it's something particularly sensitive, then of course you don't talk about it. And one of the most sensitive aspects, for example, is agent identities. And that is kept very, 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 very close, very, very far away from mainstream intelligence work. So it's not that difficult. If you have something ultra sensitive, you just keep it within a very tight team.
So let's go back to the question, who exactly are you working for when you work for MI5? Who were you working for, sorry? Who is paying your money from who are you getting your money?
You are officially employed by MI5, by the UK Domestic Security Service. So you are an employee, and that's where you are paid, that's where your money comes from. In terms of cover though, if you're asked by people outside, what do? You say that you work for the Ministry of Defence. So that's officially your cover story. Unfortunately, they don't then tell you much about the Ministry of Defence. And I remember going to certain parties and things where I would be meeting people who did work for the real Ministry of Defence, and they would say, well, who are you working with? Which team are you on, which section? And at that point, all you can say is, well, I'm working for Box, which is the sort of government slang for MI5, because they're sort of within Whitehall anyway, within the government infrastructure anyway, and they sort of understood it and then would back off. So it was a pretty poor cover story. And for MI6, they officially have to say that they work for the Foreign Office. They work under diplomatic cover.
Where does MI6 or those agencies get money for when they do black operations, false flag operations?
I'm not entirely sure, actually. The whole sort of question of budgeting and money is not something that intelligence officers tend to give much thought to, because if they want to run with something, then something will be paid for. So it's just, they've got no concept of budgeting or need to sort of prioritise financing. If they say, oh, this is an important operation, then the money comes from wherever. So it wasn't something I really knew much about.
Who gives the order to do such operations, false flag operations?
Well, I mean, there are only two that I was aware of when I was working there. I mean, one was the Gaddafi plot, the other was the Israeli embassy, which was a different agency anyway. That appears to have been Mossad, so I don't really know how they operate or how they organise those sort of things. But in terms of MI6 and the Gaddafi plot, I don't know who did authorise it. The person who should have authorised it was the Foreign Secretary. So under the Intelligence Service Act 1994, which governs what MI6 does, Section 7 says if they want to do something illegal abroad, they need to get ministerial permission for that. Otherwise it's illegal. If they get prior written permission, then it's legal and they cannot be prosecuted for it. And of course in the Gaddafi plot case, they did not get that prior ministerial permission. But they did tell David initially that they had kicked it all the way up to the Foreign Secretary and they had got approval. But apparently that wasn't the case. I mean, the Foreign Secretary at the time, that's Malcolm Rifkind, has gone on the record and said he was never approached about this. So it depends on the scale of what you're doing, but for something like that, the need to push it all the way up to the top should be in place. If it's something perhaps less crucial, it probably just have to go up to a director within the agency, that's the level.
You told me before, MI6 funded those Islamic terrorists in the 1969 it was, to kill Gaddafi with this car bombing. And you told me they were from Afghanistan, so were those former Al-Qaeda fighters, or still Al-Qaeda fighters?
It appears that some of them were linked to what we now call Al-Qaeda. I mean, at that point they were just known as veterans of the Afghan war. But it was interesting that in 1995, 1996, MI6 was funding these sort of people. MI5 had just got up and running a section called G9C, which was specifically there to investigate Islamic extremist terrorism with the Afghan veterans. So it was crazy because on the one hand you have one side of British intelligence funding these people and the other side of British intelligence trying to investigate these people. So that was crazy. But it does appear that it was a group known as, or has become known as the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was affiliated to what we call Al-Qaeda until the late 1990s. And curiously, one of the leading figures of the LIFG was a man called Abdel Hakim Belhaj. Now, he has shot to prominence since the ousting of Gaddafi last year. He is one of the top military commanders in Libya since the coup. And it's also mentioned that he might end up as Prime Minister of Libya. He's an extreme Islamist, and he's been talking about trying to impose Sharia law on Libya and everything. And he would also, strangely, LIFG renounced any sort of affiliation with Al-Qaeda in 1998. And of course they had been helped by MI6. But fast forward a little bit to when Tony Blair and Colonel Gaddafi start to get close. And suddenly MI6 is trying to help Gaddafi's intelligence agencies. So what we have is Abdel Hakim Belhaj being extraordinarily rendered, being kidnapped by MI6 and handed over to Gaddafi's intelligence agencies in Tripoli. And this happened in 2004, he was captured. And he was held for 6 years and tortured by the Libyan Gaddafi regime. So then, of course, Gaddafi, everything changes. He's released. Gaddafi is toppled. So now we've got this guy who might well be the next head of Libya, who has been betrayed by people he thought were his funders and backers, which is MI6. So you can see that MI6, with their double dealing, have set themselves up now where they might have a foreign head of state who hates them. So in terms of protecting British interests and economic interests, they've really shot themselves in the foot. So.
What was the motive behind this trying to assassinate Gaddafi?
It appears to be twofold. At that time, MI6, one of its priority jobs was to track down the suspects for the Lockerbie bombing, and evidence pointed to Libya involvement. So one of the things they were trying to do was negotiate for the handing over of the two Lockerbie suspects, Megrahi and Lamin Fima. And they kept failing to do it. They were trying backroom channels, they were trying all sorts of stuff. They couldn't get these two out of Libya for a trial. So one of the things that Tomworth promised was that they would be handed over. So that's one of the reasons they jumped at it. And of course the other one, of course, was getting lots of big fat juicy oil contracts. So, when Gaddafi came to power, he threw out all the foreign oil companies, particularly BP. And of course what MI6 was after was get rid of Gaddafi and get back into Libya with BP. And get lots of oil. So it was the two-pronged thing. Okay.
But is there a connection between the revolution, as one calls it, which happened now in Libya where Gaddafi was killed? Or was the Western interest behind it?
Yes, I think there's a very strong connection because what we're looking at is a lot of the rebels came out of Benghazi, and a lot of the tribes there are either former royalist supporters, because of course King Idris was ousted by Gaddafi in '69, or the LIFG sympathisers, so the sort of Islamist groupings, they were very strong in Benghazi as well. And people like Belhaj, who had been involved in that group, were military leaders in this coup attempt. So yes, there was a sort of linkage, and the fact that Gaddafi was hunted down and extrajudicially murdered by the rebels who had links to this group, it seems to be now what's happened is Gaddafi finally was assassinated by the same people that tried to assassinate him covertly in 1996. And I think it says a lot about our culture now that these agencies, which during the coup, during the rebellion last year, were again assisted and funded by MI6 and the CIA. It says a lot about our Western values now, that we can do these sort of things completely openly, with no outcry from any of our media and no calls for justice or anything. Whereas, only 15 years ago, they still felt they had to try and do this covertly. So I think it's shown a massive shift in what is deemed to be acceptable in levels of violence and involvement in foreign countries from 1996, post 9/11, to where we are now. And I think it's a really dangerous path we're sliding down.
What about Al-Qaeda? Are there connections between the secret agencies and between the secret services and Al-Qaeda?
I don't know enough detail from the inside. As I said, MI5 had set up a section to start investigating Al-Qaeda in 1995. So no doubt they will have recruited agents to work within these sort of terrorist groupings. I don't know personally anything about that. Of course there have been reports since that there were links between the CIA and Osama bin Laden and all that sort of thing, but I don't know that from the inside. So.
Okay. You were investigating by MI5 Irish terrorism. I read once an article about a British policeman who said that he built bombs for the IRA. Were there also false flag operations in Ireland?
Yes, yeah. There were certainly dirty tricks in Northern Ireland, on both sides, both Loyalist and Republican. For example, in the early 1970s, there were a couple of big pub bombings in Dublin, which were blamed on Loyalist terrorists. and it turned out there was a judicial inquiry, the Barron inquiry, and it turned out that those loyalist groups had been helped by the security forces in Northern Ireland. So that was a very clear case, again, of false flag terrorism. And of course there were dirty tricks, and there has been involvement even after the Good Friday Agreement, when the peace process was sort of formalised in Northern Ireland. There have been splinter groups from the old provisional IRA. There's now the real IRA and various other sort of continuity IRA and various other little groups. And the real IRA, I think it was implicated in the Omagh bombing in 1998, which killed a massive number of people. And yet there were British agents in place who had actually warned the MI5 that there was going to be this attack, and nothing was done to stop it. So that's not necessarily their involvement, but it certainly shows a degree of complicity to allow something to go ahead.
I read that friends of you, supporters and journalists were put on trial when they were talking about or looking at the issues that you were covering up. How did this work? Or what trial did they put them?
Well, it varied. I mean, in the UK, the media is very controlled by the intelligence agencies, and they do it two ways, the sort of carrot and stick. And the carrot tends to be that journalists are approached and given nice stories and sort of inducted into this little charmed circle where they get the good briefings. And then sometimes some of them go a little bit further and become what are called agents of influence. So they then tip off the spy agencies if there's a story brewing in a newspaper, or they can plant fake stories or whatever. And then the stick is this whole raft of different legislation which the government can prosecute the media with if the media steps out of line. Now, one of the things they can use is the Official Secrets Act. Now, this is a piece of law that is designed to stop whistleblowers. The 1989 Official Secrets Act is there to stop whistleblowing. If you work for the agencies and you speak out about the work you've seen in the agencies, you face 2 years in prison as a whistleblower. That's it. But what is less well known outside media circles is that journalists can also be put in prison under the OSA. If they report what the whistleblower says, and that report is deemed to have caused damage to national security, they also face 2 years in prison. Actually, intriguingly, even in Russia, apparently journalists don't get prosecuted for reporting whistleblower stuff. It's only in Britain, which is great. So way to go, British democracy. But so in the case of David's journalist coverage, only one journalist was actually convicted in the end, but many, many journalists were threatened with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. And there's another way also, because after David first went public, the government they put an injunction on the media and also on David Shayler, which meant that they couldn't publish anything without getting it cleared by the government first. And there was one instance in 1999 where an editor of a national magazine called Punch wanted to expose the Bishopsgate story, which is another example of MI5 making mistakes and covering it up and a bomb going off. And so he wanted to get this published, and he submitted it for clearance way ahead of the deadline. And the spy lawyers just sat on it for weeks and wouldn't do anything. So eventually he and David looked at it and wrote it incredibly carefully so it could not cause any damage. And then James Steen, who was the editor, went ahead and published it. And it was only immediately afterwards that the MI5 lawyers came back with their version of it. And it was crazy things they wanted taking out, like so-and-so, who was a terrorist suspect, went on the run to Ireland. And MI5 wanted that changed to so-and-so went over to Ireland. Now, you know what the qualitative difference is, I don't know, but they seem to think that could damage national security. Anyway, James Steen, because of that, was not prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, but he was prosecuted because of the injunction. And the charge that he faced was contempt of court because he'd knowingly broken the injunction. And he ended up with a conviction, lost his job, everything. But other journalists were threatened. The police tried to issue production orders on newspapers so that they had the powers to go in and look at all the newspaper databases, which of course the newspapers really didn't like, and they challenged and won. And there was another guy called Martin Bright who was threatened with prosecution, and it looked like he was going to be hung out to dry at one point, but the journalists' union sort of backed him up. And there was also a student journalist called Julianne Davis. Now she was a student who ran her own university newspaper in London. And she was quite bright, very bright, very switched on, and she just thought, well, it'd be a good idea to go to Paris and meet this David Shayler and see what he's got to say. And David said yes, so she went over, she had a nice lunch, she wrote up a nice piece, and then she was sitting in her student lecture theatre one day, and all these special branch secret police guys came in and arrested her, so hauled her out of the lecture theatre. And they arrested her under the 1911 Official Secrets Act, which is the Anti-Treachery, Anti-Espionage Act. And she never found out why. don't know what they thought she was going to do with this interview. I don't know what they thought she discovered by going over for lunch with David Shayler. But it was interesting that they were very heavy-handed with a student journalist with no power, but they were much more careful when it came to dealing with the major media, because of course they had money and lawyers and everything. So anyway, Julianne actually sued in the end for wrongful arrest and won, which was good.
It's good that those things are coming in public and people getting to know about this.
Well, it did, but unfortunately all this happened a long time ago. I mean, we're talking about a decade ago. And people sort of forget about this now. You know, it's just before YouTube and the internet. And
okay. Were the media interested in this story at this time?
oh, huge, yes. It's a huge story that ran on for years.
Okay.
Got a lot of coverage and also a lot of pushback from the government and the intelligence spin doctors. So some newspapers were very supportive and some newspapers were very, very... they just shredded David's reputation. I mean, they were saying things like he should be shot and he's a traitor and he should be horsewhipped and things. But the worst bit, I think, was he went back voluntarily. He'd been living in France for 3 years and he went back in 2000 to get arrested, to stand trial, because he knew he'd have to go through it at some point. And he wanted his day in court where he could give evidence about the Gaddafi plot. He was never charged with the Gaddafi plot, so he was not allowed to speak about it during his trial. And of course he was found guilty. But what happened with the media afterwards was much more frightening, because the formal ruling after his conviction, the judge said 3 things, which were David Shayler did what he did in the public interest, he had no financial motivation, and he never risked any agent lives by his whistleblowing. And this was a formal judgment, so all the journalists write this down, and then the next day all the newspapers said precisely the opposite. So you're sort of thinking, well, where did this come from? You know, the journalists were hearing what I heard sitting in court, so how was it changed to Shayler sells agent lives down the river for money, which is what the newspapers said. So of course that got me really thinking and investigating about the nexus between the media and the spies.
Okay.
So it's quite interesting.
You told me before about influencing the media through secret services. How did it change in the last years? Did it become worse? Are there more agents inside of media, or...?
I think the control of the national media in the UK has definitely become worse since 9/11, absolutely. And this is for a number of reasons. I mean, one, there was an academic study done by a very prominent journalist in the UK called Nick Davis, and he looked at how much copy journalists have to produce every day, and it's actually double, they have to produce double the copy in half the time that they had to produce 25 years ago. So this, of course, he calls it churnalism, they're churning it out. So this, of course, leads them to become very reliant on briefings from government and big business and the intelligence agencies. So they get a PR and they just basically rewrite it and put it in the newspaper. They don't have time to investigate. And the other problem as well, I think we've seen in the last decade or so, is centralisation of ownership of the media, very much so. And once you have just, say, a few big figures running most of the media, the national media, it's very, very easy for them to be influenced, cosy lunches and chats by the heads of MI5, MI6 or government, to take a line on a story. And I think it became very stark after 9/11, when there was a sort of call to war to go into Iraq. And there was no evidence, there was no intelligence. It was all fake intelligence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And yet somehow the spin managed to come out saying precisely the opposite. That, I mean, I remember there was a screaming headline on a tabloid newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch, it was called The Sun, and it said 45 minutes from doom, Britain's 45 minutes from doom. And what he was saying was, they had these weapons of mass destruction and they had the missile capability to strike British interests within 45 minutes of the order being given. And this all came out on the eve of the parliamentary vote about whether Britain should go to war. So in terms of government and intelligence spinning the media in order to scare the MPs to vote for a certain outcome, very, very stark indeed. So you've got the problem, you've got the centralisation of ownership, and you've got the sort of poor journalists who are squeezed to produce more copy, who are also very, very shaky about job security, because of course the old media is withering. You know, it's not selling, people are not trusting it, they don't buy the newspapers so much anymore, so the economic model is folding and all the newspapers are losing money. So journalists are under real pressure, if they want to keep their job, to not rock the boat, to get the stories the government and whoever wants them to print. And you know, they don't have time to investigate even if they do want to.
So it's mostly this media system which doesn't let them give real information, more than secret services which are putting agents inside of the media.
Well, yes, there are agents of influence, as they're called. That's how they tend to be seen. So they might have gone to the same university, have a friend who went to work for MI5 or MI6, and then meet up for a nice little cosy lunch or something. and the friend asked them for a favour.
Okay. But they have a section of MI6 which is responsible for psychological warfare, for IOPS.
Yes. That actually stands for information operations.
Yeah.
So it's actually for media management.
Yeah.
And that section plants fake stories in the media. It's as bald-faced as that.
Is this a big section? Are there many people?
I don't think it's that large, or it certainly wasn't when David was aware of it in the 1990s, but it might well have grown since then, should we say. But yes, I mean, having that, where they can go to their team journalists on certain newspapers and say, we've got this story, we run with it. I mean, there's a very infamous case in the 1990s again, where Saif al-Islam, the son of Gaddafi, the one who went on the run, has now been captured, wanted to come to the UK to study at a London university, and MI6 didn't want him coming over and living the sort of playboy lifestyle because he was the son of their number one enemy at the time. So what they did was they planted a fake story in the media, and they had two officers posing as bankers who went to see one of their favourite journalists, a guy called Con Coughlin, on the Sunday Telegraph, and they showed him documents which purported to prove that Saif al-Islam was involved in money laundering of currency movements via Iran. And this guy wasn't allowed, the journalist wasn't allowed to keep copies of the documents, he was only allowed to read them. But he trusted these people because he'd been put in contact with them by one of his MI6 contacts. So he thought they were bankers, he wrote the story, suddenly the story is in all the other newspapers, so it becomes fact. So then when Saif al-Islam applies for a visa to come to the UK, MI5 has to check him. They see all this coverage about how he's been money laundering, so they block his visa and he's not allowed in. Now then Shayler blew the whistle on this. Saif al-Islam then sues the Sunday Telegraph, and Shayler's about to give evidence, so the Sunday Telegraph settles. And Saif al-Islam could have gone for exemplary damages, but he chose not to, because a few months later he was allowed into the study at the LSE, and he was given police protection as well. MI6 helped him all the way because they wanted to make up for being caught out before. And of course, once he was in the UK, he acted as a broker, a power broker between Libya and the establishment in the UK, figures like Peter Mandelson and BP and things like that, in order to start brokering the rapprochement with Gaddafi. And then that led to the Blair meeting, the deal in the desert. And then, of course, a lot of nice oil contracts started opening up to British Petroleum and things. So he was allowed in because he'd embarrassed the intelligence agencies by catching them out. But he was also allowed in, so he'd become the sort of back channel to facilitate dirty deals.
When we read about the psychological warfare, they always explain this against the enemy, against the outside. Is it also allowed to do psychological warfare against the own population?
What do you mean by psychological warfare?
Propaganda, disinformation, like make a false flag operation and tell your people someone else did it.
Well, they certainly appear to be doing that left, right and centre. So no, I think the whole leverage that the spies have now, certainly with the media, that they can get away. I mean, they can say black is white. And it's interesting, though, because I think people are becoming more and more sceptical about what they do ingest from the mainstream media. And, the economic model of the old media is withering. And I think it's usually older people who still consume it. Most people don't now. They just get their news off the internet. Even if it's from the old media on the internet, they still look at a variety of sources. So it is harder for the spies to control the news that people ingest. And I think that will become harder and harder. But I think also that's why the governments and the powers that be are finding ways to try and crack down on what we can access on the internet as well. They're a bit worried about that.
But is this section for IOPS meant for working in foreign countries, or are they also allowed to work in England themselves?
Well, they have worked in England because they did with the Saif al-Islam story.
Yeah, but
I don't know how wide-ranging it is beyond that.
Okay. So let me ask you a question about British policy. What is there a difference between Blair and Cameron, between those two administrations?
I don't think there is much difference at all. I mean, it doesn't matter who you vote for in the UK, the government gets in. And in fact, of course, most people didn't vote for Cameron, but he doesn't have a democratic mandate. But no, I mean, they were both part of the establishment, the British establishment. And Britain's very famous for its sort of class system, and rightly so. You have this sort of grouping and a sort of elite grouping of overlapping interests, and it can be politics or the civil service or the intelligence agencies or the military, the City of London, of course, the media. And all these people, it's almost like a system of revolving doors. They all tend to know each other and have the same background and have the same interests. And they are quite exclusive. They will sort of close ranks against other people, and they usually operate in their group interests, shall we say.
Okay.
And I think actually what we're seeing now is a global elite along the same lines. Things like Davos and Bilderberg and all the various things like Trilateral Commission. where you have a global elite of similar figures, just at a much more senior level, operating in the same way, again, working in the same interests. So I don't think there's a huge difference. I mean, one of the definitions of a totalitarian regime is that you have a one-party state. And effectively what we do have in the UK is a one-party state. You can't differentiate now between the parties. You know, they're all neoliberals, they're all going for austerity measures, they're all going for shredding of our civil liberties, anti-protest, everything.
What do you mean he was not democratically elected?
Well, he didn't get a clear majority, which is why there's a coalition government. So he has to rely on the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, who were supposed to be anti-war, anti-student fees, anti-this, anti-that, and they just got a taste of power for the first time ever. And now they're just bending over and taking whatever Cameron gives them. So. Okay.
How does it actually come that Great Britain doesn't have a constitution?
Well, we don't need it, we're British. Well, everything in Britain is a very historic mess. It's just evolved gradually over the centuries, a bit like the intelligence agencies evolved gradually. So it's interesting, if you look at a bit of British history, we've never had a proper full-blown revolution. Well, we had the Civil War, we had it in the 17th century. We've never had a sort of guillotine moment. So every time there has been radical pressure building up, the establishment's been canny enough to sort of just give a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, be it, you know, the rights of MPs or the right of men to vote over a certain age with a certain amount of property, or the right of all men to vote but not women, and then, you know, a little bit over the years they give. And that's the same way as our basic rights, our traditional freedoms have evolved as well. So we take for granted, and a lot of people in Britain don't even know we don't have a written constitution. They assume we've got something. We take for granted that our rights are enshrined. If you actually look at all the laws that have been passed since 9/11, we've got damn few rights left. I mean, we can be arbitrarily arrested, we can be interned in prison on the say-so of intelligence officers. We can be arrested just so they can identify who we are. If certain emergency powers are passed by one government minister, they can quarantine us, they can stop us moving freely around, they can stop us having political meetings, they can seize our houses and demolish them in the name of national security and not have to pay any compensation. So, you know, there's all these different laws that have come in which have effectively made Britain a police state. It's just, it's not noticeable for the vast majority of people yet. The people who are on the receiving end of that sort of treatment tend to be young Muslim males, tend to be protesters particularly. So, you know, we don't have a right to protest outside Parliament anymore, for example. And there was quite a frightening episode last April. It was great, wonderful British pomp and circumstance. We had the royal wedding and everyone was so happy, Prince William and Kate getting married, blah, blah, blah. Well, not everybody. I mean, there were a lot of demonstrators who were pretty angry about the waste of money and anti-monarchy. And they wanted to go along and use a megaphone or have some street theatre to make their point about being Republican. And they were, the night before the royal wedding, they were preemptively arrested by the police based on intelligence the police had gathered from their agents within these groups or from Facebook or from Twitter. They were arrested in their own homes, taken off and held 24 hours by the police and then released with no charge. And they hadn't done anything. So what they were effectively being done for was thought crime. They were suspected they might think about doing something. And yeah, it is, totally. And one of the things one of these groups wanted to do was street theatre. They had a fake guillotine. And they wanted to take a dummy of Prince Andrew and guillotine it. And I always thought it was funny. I mean, why? You know, what's the difference between Prince Andrew and a dummy anyway? But so they were arrested for that. And it was around that time that the Syrian rebellion started. And the government was rounding up dissidents, you know, banging on their home doors, dragging them away because they might be troublemakers in the future. And we had our Foreign Secretary William Hague at the time standing up and saying, this is out of order. This is an authoritarian regime. You can't do this to people who haven't done anything yet. This is preemptive arrest. We don't do that. Well, of course, and then they go and do it in the UK. So what we're seeing is the same principle at play in the UK as we're seeing in Syria. It's not the same scale of brutality yet, but it's the same principle. And I think more and more people are waking up to that fact. The other thing that also got people thinking last year was there was a huge scandal about undercover cops. And it emerged that there's been this massive operation of full-time policemen infiltrating protest groups. And they've been doing it for 4 decades. And for the last 15 years, they've been doing it outside the police force. They've been doing it for a private organisation, a company. So it's completely unaccountable, no oversight or anything. And they were infiltrating entirely innocent groups, you know, climate protest, anti-runways, you know, whatever, environmental groups. And the only reason they're allowed to infiltrate these groups is to protect national security. Now, I'm sorry, you know, a bunch of hippies sitting around at the end of the runway smoking a bit of pot is not
threat to national security.
No. So it was a gross violation, it was grossly undemocratic, and it caused a huge scandal. But now what they did was the police said, oops, sorry, we didn't need to do that. It's not as bad as you think it is. So they reabsorbed these people, these officers, into the counter-terrorism command. And we're seeing that the police call demonstrators and protesters domestic extremists, which is only one step away from being a terrorist, of course. So you can see the sort of the swelling of their interest in the overlap into these
Through
groups.
the language also.
Yeah, it's conditioning the police officers who do this.
What do you think? Is the royal family in Great Britain still influential when one sees the country is still called the British Kingdom, and it's still we have the Commonwealth and whatever? Do they have much influence on the government?
Well, they're not allowed to be seen to be political, but of course they have. They pull strings behind the scenes. I mean, one example of that recently is the Conservative government, coalition government, has suddenly started saying that because it's Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee or something this year, we should give her a present. The grateful nation giving this billionairess a present. Let's give her a £60 million yacht, royal yacht. And there, of course, there was an outcry. Even the right-wing newspapers, all the comments were saying, why the hell are we supposed to be, this is the age of austerity, why are we supposed to be giving our hard-earned tax to pay for some toy for, this hugely wealthy family? And it turned out that the palace had been lobbying key ministers and then got the key ministers to do their dirty work by flying this idea to the British public. And of course, it's not going to happen on taxpayers' money now. So they're not allowed to be seen to be political, but of course they have contacts with these establishment figures, and they, have weekly meetings with the Prime Minister, and they can make their wishes known. And also in terms of our lack of constitution, this comes back into play because Her Majesty's government theoretically can be, anything they pass as legislation, the Queen has to sign, so theoretically she can veto it. She doesn't, but she could.
Okay.
And the police force are crown servants. They're not public servants, they're not state servants, they belong to the Queen. And the army, the military, are served directly to the Queen. So, for example, if there is ever widespread economic unrest, if there was rioting on the streets, if it looked like there could be radical revolution or something, then the military and the police could be ordered by the royal family just to crack down on their fellow citizens. Fellow subjects, because that's what we are in the UK.
Crazy.
So, even though there's no sort of heavy duty influence or power wielding, there is still a lot of residual power there if the royal family chooses to
there
use
is
it.
a lot of structure left in the monarchy.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Iran, actual situation right now. What are the Western interests in Iran? Are there covert operations? What's going on?
Well, I'm not an expert on Iran, but I mean, when I was working with Senator Mike Revell last year, he's been looking at it a lot. And he estimates that about $400 million was spent in the last year inside Iran trying to subvert the Iranian government. So I have no doubt, of course, there will be CIA operatives there, there will be recruiting agents, they will be trying to foment dissent. And similarly with Israel. I think there was a scandal recently, wasn't there, where Mossad agents were posing as CIA agents to recruit agents.
Yeah, that too. They're killing scientists there.
Yes, well, someone's killing scientists. And of course, the Iranians say it must be Mossad, but someone is killing the scientists.
Sure.
I have no doubt that they are trying to foment some sort of, or trying to subvert the Iranian state. And I think also something similar is probably going on in Russia at the moment as well.
Russia?
Yeah. I mean, all this sort of pro-democracy and everything. Of course, people are frustrated that it is quite an authoritarian country. But I think that the unrest is probably being aided by, shall we say, outside influence as well. It was interesting, I don't know if you remember, about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a scandal about a spy rock found in Moscow. And this was a rock, literally, left on a street, which contained a little computer. And this was the sort of modern equivalent of a dead letter drop. So MI6 had planted this thing, and their agents could walk past and press a button on their phone and beam information to this spy rock. And then the MI6 officers would walk past and retrieve it. And the Russians apparently knew about this for quite a long time, so they're probably putting chicken feed into it anyway. Anyway, they decide at one point, enough's enough, we're going to make a big scandal about this. MI6 is operating in Russia. And then there was a big international embarrassment. And then Putin used that as a chance not to eject the MI6 officers, but to say, yes, but we know Western interests are trying to subvert Russia at the moment. And he closed down loads of Western NGOs and human rights agencies that were funded by the West, which were indeed being used to stir up dissent within Russia. And in the last couple of weeks, the spy rock story has reared its ugly head again. and pressure has been put on the government in the UK to say, yes, we did actually do this. And so there's been this huge rehash by the UK government about Putin cracking down on Western agencies in Russia because, you know, he's anti-human rights in Russia. So it's funny how that little story has been reused to highlight now the current dissent fomented apparently by these Western NGOs and human rights groups. So I don't know exactly what's going on there, but...
Okay. Again, back to Iran. How is the situation there? Do you think will they do further these operations and provoke Iran so much until there will be a war?
It's a difficult one to call, isn't it? I mean, certainly Iran's allies are lining up, and you know, it's like Iran's the little kid in the playground, and you've got sort of China behind them, Russia and China, and China particularly. You know, you mess with Iran, you're going to be messing with us. I would hope that most of our governments would be sensible enough not to provoke it too much. I suppose the major worry is that Israel does something absolutely nuts and unilaterally goes in and bombs something in Iran, and then turns to the US and says, you know, right, we're in it, you've got to come and back us up. And then the US pulls in the UK and other Western governments. And if we do get to that situation, it's going to be incredibly messy, and we probably would be looking at something like World War III. So, I don't know. It's just a case of fingers crossed, really, at the moment.
If they would attack nuclear power plants in Iran, would it be more or less the same as if they would throw an atomic bomb on Iran?
What you mean, the effect? I don't know, I'm not an expert on it. Although I believe the prevailing winds tend to go over Israel, so that might be a bit stupid to do.
Okay. What's about Syria? It's also an unstable situation right now. What's going on there?
Well, again, that's, you know, Syria was part of the axis of evil that George Bush talked about. So, you know, it's another way of sort of circling. If they can get rid of their current regime and put their puppets in place, of course, there's yet more power bases in the Middle East, which is what they want. They want to secure that area.
Why Syria?
Well, it's not intensely oil-rich, is it? I think it's more just location.
Oh, let's ask you about your work that you're doing now. You work with Mike Rebel together on a democratic movement.
Yeah, I do all sorts of stuff, actually. I do a lot of public speaking at conferences and to different groups and writing and things. And yes, it was great to be asked last year to organise a little tour of Europe with Senator Gravel to promote direct democracy. And I think, you know, what he's talking about there is a very interesting concept, because there are so many different protest groups now springing up. You know, so much to be angry about in the world, you know, financial, war on terror, everything like that. Just the blatant injustice. And yet, from experience I've seen, and you know, from the inside as well, when I was supposedly investigating those sort of groups, there's a lot of initial enthusiasm. Then there's a learning process, and the group does very well, and they find their stride, and they get quite effective. And then the good people can get burnt out because, you know, you keep banging your head against a brick wall, you get frustrated. And also, of course, if you become effective enough, then you will be infiltrated and subverted, and arguments will be caused, and the group will split. So there's a sort of classic trajectory of most protest groups. So what Mike Gravel has devised, I think, is a very interesting tool, a democratic tool, to help these protest groups. So rather than trying to protest against the current system, or protest and try and change the current system from within, which is never going to work, it's so difficult, he's suggesting that you have this sort of legislative tool that goes around the existing system and brings direct democracy to the people. So what he's proposing is that all these protest groups can use this legislation and try and effect change that way. And it's interesting because, of course, we came to Switzerland last autumn, and he met the Occupy group, and that was an amazing experience. He was so buoyed up by that and the work of the Occupy group. And of course, Switzerland has this amazing international reputation of wonderful hands-on direct democracy. But of course, then it turns out that it's direct democracy so far, but actually the legislature can actually veto the democratic will at the last minute if they so choose. So what Mike is saying is that's not direct democracy, we need to get rid of that. So for example, if his legislation could be campaigned for and implemented in Switzerland of all places, and it was adopted in Switzerland, the wonderful democratic example to the rest of the world, think about the example that would be made to the rest of the world, that things can be improved even from this situation. So that could be an interesting one.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. It'd be a great idea. I hope you will be successful with this idea. Is there anything else you want to tell to our readers, or a vision or something to motivate them?
Well, I think it's a very crucial couple of years coming up. I mean, with this sort of all these problems that we're facing, like the erosion of our civil liberties and the war on terror, and you know the deteriorating situation in the Middle East, and the economic meltdown, austerity measures. And so it's a very difficult time that we're all facing, and I think we need to keep our eye on, you know, who's behind all this sort of this global elite, this global establishment that's causing so many of these problems, and really get active, get out there, get protesting, get informed, read around whatever takes your interest and really dig under the surface of what the mainstream media is telling you. And then, do get active. Join up with some of these protest groups, go and support Occupy or go and support, any other protest group that really grabs your attention. And if you can't do that personally, then help them by helping them financially, the people who can go and do this. But also I'd say to the protest groups as well, is again, keep your eye on the ball. Don't lose sight of what the major problems are by getting bogged down in petty internal politics or allowing the groups to be divided by argumentative people. Keep an eye out for possible infiltrators and hang together. And I suppose the other way, one thing that does give me hope as well, particularly as we're looking at this sort of electronic surveillance state that seems to be taking us over as well, the erosion of our digital civil liberties, is to support your local geeks. I think one of the greatest hopes we have is the hackers who can get around these blockages, who can get around the denial of our freedom of expression and the right to protest and privacy and all these sort of things. So it's really, one, support people who are doing that work as well, organisations like WikiLeaks or political parties like the Pirate Party, for example, and also personally take responsibility for your own privacy. We don't all have to use Facebook, we don't all have to use Twitter, we don't have to use American-based accounts and websites, because we can be shut down, we can be prosecuted for them. So let's learn a bit ourselves about what we can do to take protective measures so we can be more effective ourselves. So there's a lot to do, but it's just about being informed and being passionate and being true to yourself and getting out there and trying to make a difference, because some difficult years coming up.
Thanks a lot for being with us. Thanks for the interview, and
Thank you.